OMG, OMG, OMG. Here we are. 6 years later, I am here in the studio at OB Media in Philadelphia, and I am ready. And I know that we are ready. We have been ready for some time to start a podcast devoted to the Journal of Black Sexuality and Relationships. What a ride this has been for so long. And if anyone had ever asked me 6 years ago about what this would look like and what this would even sound like, I would have said, hell no, no way, this is not happening. So my name is Dr. James Wadley. I'm faculty at Lincoln University, and I'm also a clinician in the area and maintain a private practice in Philadelphia as well as in Pennington, New Jersey. And it just so happens that I was fortunate enough to stumble upon a wonderful advertisement about hosting a journal. And so I stumbled upon OB Media, and at the professional nudge of several colleagues, I'm here in the studio this morning. So before I start talking about the evolution of the journal as well as the implications for the journal, and I will say that I will have a special guest on this podcast, and that person's name is Dr. Leah Hollis. She's done significant work not only for Morgan State University, but also in the community. I just wanted to spend some time offering a few shout outs to the people and the entities that have made this possible. So I want to send a special shout out to the University of Nebraska Press for believing in this project or this initiative and allowing it to come to fruition. Just real quick, I wanted to share the story behind the University of Nebraska Press. So 6 years ago, I started to write a book on Black sexuality and relationships, and there were a number of books that had been written up until this point, particularly by Juan Battle and Sandra Barnes, Robert Staples, as well as a host of other people and entities out there. And so I wanted to offer something different because the books that had come out at that time around 2009, 2010, 2011, they were great in their own right, and I didn't want to try to reinvent the wheel or try to walk in the giant footsteps that were before me. So on a flight between Philadelphia and Dallas, somewhere in there, I was spiritually touched to begin thinking about the possibility of starting a journal. And the rationale behind the journal is that I wanted to offer something where people could contribute their research, clinical best practice, as well as pedagogy on a regular basis. So, when you write a book, the book comes out, people may buy it over the next 4 or 6 months or even a year, and then over time the book fades. And it doesn't necessarily fade because it's not a good book, but usually someone else writes a book that may be more relevant to the current time. So if I write a book in 2014, by the time 2016, 2017 hits, there's already new material out there. And so the journal would give us or give our community an opportunity to submit articles on a continuous basis. And so the journal, as you may know, is released quarterly, and it's interdisciplinary. So we draw articles and manuscripts from people who are in the fields of obviously sexology, but also psychology, sociology, anthropology, physiology, and many of the disciplines related to the arts. And so I've been grateful for that. So nevertheless, I put together a proposal for starting a journal. That's what it was. And what was pretty cool about it was that, about the proposal, is that it was widely accepted. And so I got feedback quite quickly over the next, 2-3 weeks, or maybe even a month. And the University of Nebraska Press got back to me, and they were like, all right, James, let's go for it. So when they sent me the email and said, James, let's go for it, honestly, I was freaking out. I'm like, oh my gosh, this baby has some legs on it. And so the folks in Nebraska Press asked me, Well, James, well, who's on your editorial board? So I started freaking out some more because at that point I didn't have anybody on my editorial board. So I had reached out to several folks near and far. At the time, I was sitting on the board for the American Association of Blacks in Higher Ed. And I asked a couple of folks who I sat on the board with. And then I asked some colleagues in and around Philadelphia as well as beyond. So I submitted the first list of board members. And I believe at that time we had between, 14 to 15 people. And so once I submitted the names of the board members as well as their curriculum vitae, the folks at Nebraska Press said, "Good, great, let's go for it, let's roll." So I knew that I had about 6 months to get out the first issue, and I wasn't quite sure what that issue was going to look like in terms of getting manuscripts and getting people to review manuscripts and getting people to edit the manuscripts. And it ended up turning out okay. Yeah, it ended up turning out okay. We kicked out our first issue, like I said, about 6 years ago, and it's really turned out to be a fascinating ride. So let me go back to the shout out list. So obviously, again, thank you to University of Nebraska Press for helping me put this idea together. And then special shout out to the editorial board, both past members as well as current members of our editorial board. The editorial board is vast right now. So we started off with 15 and now we're at 30. And I will say that the folks on the editorial board, they are dynamic, they are extraordinary, they have done great work around the sexual expression of persons of African descent or Black folks, or sometimes people say African American. But, with the board members, they have been a tremendous support and a tremendous resource for any number of reasons as it relates to procuring manuscripts and editing manuscripts and helping me or us, put this initiative together. Next shout out goes to the authors of the JBSR. So the authors who have contributed over the past 6 years. Again, we put out an issue quarterly. And so each issue is comprised of about 150 pages, including the editorial note. And the authors have produced extraordinary manuscripts that range from contraceptive technology to sexual decision making, to issues around intersectionality, to gender issues, to sexual orientation identity issues, to parenting, to how religion intersects with sexuality, just the whole 9 yards. And so the journal would not exist without folks sending us their manuscripts and having folks have a lot of faith in this project. Because again, prior to 2013, 2014, this kind of medium did not exist. And I'll go into a little bit more about the history of how this came to be. The next shout I want to do is to my host institution, Lincoln University. So Lincoln University, I've been at Lincoln now for 10 years. And Lincoln and we have a pretty good relationship. And, it is a marriage now that I'm tenured. And, like most marriages, there are a lot of good times. Like most marriages, there's a lot of challenging times. And so, but I just wanted to make sure that I honored, the position that Lincoln University has in my life and allowing me to become something different professionally and become something different in order to support the needs of the community that has supported my work. Then the next shout out goes to a few of my BFFs, which include Another Door Opens Recovery. They're a drug and alcohol agency there in Trenton, New Jersey. And I've been working with them part-time for maybe about 6-7 years. I do clinical supervision for them, and they have done and have evolved into being a beacon of not only clinical services, but also of hope for people who struggle with drug or alcohol addiction. The next entity I want to thank is the Pennsylvania Health Management Corporation. So I started doing work with them earlier this year. related to parents talking to their kids about sex and parents being open to being talked to about sex and talked with about sex. And oftentimes, conversations about sexuality with parents can be elusive. And the conversations that parents have with their kids can also be elusive. And so I've been joined by an extraordinary team, or I've joined an extraordinary team to try to pull that work together. And then I also want to thank the folks here at OB Media for being open to taking on this initiative with me. Again, when the journal came out 6 years ago, I never envisioned sitting here today in the studio talking about Black sexuality and relationships, and how people express themselves to themselves as well as how people express themselves in their relationship. And so special shout out to the good folks here in offering me this space and this platform to host a different kind of conversation. So, why don't I share a little bit about myself, not too much, but just talk a little bit about how I got to this point and the goal for having the podcast on sexuality and relationships. So my journey in this field started back at my host institution at my alum. I'm an alum of Hampton University, so I was there in the psychology department, and the department chair at the time was the late Reginald Jones, who produced the book Black Psychology. And so during my last year at Hampton, I was invited. We all had to do a capstone project, and we have to do a final paper or whatever. And so I started working. I wasn't quite sure about what I was going to do my capstone project on, and so I always wanted to work with kids, and so I ended up doing something on children's toy choices. In a sense, why do boys choose trucks and why do some little girls choose dolls? And so my professor at the time was very curious about how gender roles are constructed and how gender identity was constructed. And she actually nudged me to go down this path. And so I finished at Hampton moons ago. I'm not going to go into the year that I graduated from school, but I ended up applying for grad school down in the southeast region of the United States. I ended up at the University of Kentucky. And at Kentucky, I was in the school psychology program. And for those of you who are school psychologists or who have aspirations for being a school psychologist, when you're a school psychologist, it's a lot of freaking testing that goes on. So as a school psychologist, you go into the school, you test kids, and you're doing biopsychosocials, you're doing psychological assessments, psychoeducational assessments. And what I quickly learned is that it's very difficult to test somebody or test a 7 or 8-year-old in trying to get them to sit still to respond to particular items on an instrument. And so clearly that was not in my spirit to do. But Kentucky was good for me. I was in school for a couple of years at Kentucky, and Kentucky wanted me to work for a year before I went on to pursue my doctorate. And I just knew that wasn't going to be the path that I really wanted to take. And so, because I knew that if I ever made any money, I'd never want to go back to school because I had difficulty saving money at the time. So no money means a little bit more focus for me. So I started to get brochures from up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and I found out that the University of Pennsylvania had a human sexuality and education program. So I applied and I got in hopes that I would have an opportunity to continue to explore gender identity as well as gender roles. And so at the University of Pennsylvania, it was the best 6 years of my life. And what made it the best 6 years of my life compared to the 4 years that I spent at Hampton is that my friends and my colleagues were anything other than Black, middle-class, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christian, cisgendered. And it was awesome. The people around me were supportive. The people around me were not only supportive, but they were patient in my own growth and in my own evolution to become either a psychologist or a therapist, and as well as an educator. And I will always be grateful for the folks who extended themselves to me in that way, both personally as well as professionally. So I spent 6 years at the University of Pennsylvania and ended up doing my dissertation on sexual decision making among African American males, and how sometimes black men, we struggle to use condoms consistently and correctly. And for those of you who are sexologists and historians, during the 1990s, early 1990s, that's when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was becoming more prominent in our society. And so the thrust of my research centered around trying to create not only curricula, but also find out why some black men struggle to use condoms. And as a matter of fact, I could probably conflate that to why some young adults don't use condoms when they are, with their partners or whoever it is they may be spending time with. So I did 6 years at the University of Pennsylvania. And then after that, I worked around for a number of community mental health agencies working with special needs children and their families. So back at the University of Kentucky, I happened to be there during the time that the diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder was becoming more mainstream. And so the work that I started to do in Philadelphia, working for a number of different agencies, it fit, but it just felt like there could be something different for me professionally. So I ended up doing another 4 years clinical postgrad work in addition to working. I did postgrad work at Council for Relationships or Thomas Jefferson University. And what was significant about that is that the folks there really taught me how to be a better therapist than what I was. Using the family systems model or clinical orientation, I learned how to work effectively with not only families, but also doing couples work. And so the work as a therapist is multidimensional and multifaceted. And some, depending upon your clinical orientation, doing couples work is also can be an extension of oneself in order to help couples evolve into becoming something different, or helping them address whatever the presenting issue is of why they may have walked through the door. And so I did 4 years there, and hell, I'll tell you what, by the time I was 34, I was like, I'm done with school. I got to get the hell out of the classroom because I'm tired and I'm broken down. So I ended up getting a job at STAR, which is over off of the main line. It's sexual trauma and recovery. And there I was doing, at the time, it was called sex addiction work. And I happened to be peer supervised or mentored by a good friend of mine. His name is Alphonse Pignataro. And he was very instrumental in helping me learn how to be an even better therapist and learn how to conduct groups in a way that I couldn't have imagined. And so after some time, I'll tell you, I was working at STAR, and I'll never forget this. This was 2010. And that year, the Steelers went to the Super Bowl, right? So how does all this relate to anything? So the Steelers went to the Super Bowl, and they were playing Seattle Seahawks. And I was fortunate enough to get tickets to go to the damn game. And I tell you what, the Steelers won the Super Bowl. That was Super Bowl 40. And Hines Ward got the MVP. And I'll tell you what, I was on this euphoric high for at least 2.5, 3 months afterwards, because the Steelers hadn't won a Super Bowl since, 1981? So that was a 27-year gap, 27-year gap. And so I came back, and, I came back into Philadelphia after the Super Bowl, and, again, I was on this high, and then I was doing crappy work, or I was doing shit work, right? And so STAR, they were like, look, James, you can't see clients for 25, 30 minutes and then let them go. You got to do your job, man. And because you haven't done your job, we're going to let you go. But even with that, they said, honestly, you are ready to start your own private practice. And so, even though they fired me, they encouraged me to go ahead and become a different kind of professional. So I didn't really have any mentorship around setting up a private practice. So I ended up seeing people out of my home in Northern Liberties in Philadelphia, and that was weird because I didn't want people to come over to my damn house and, see where I lived at as a therapist. And so back in 2010, that was a memorable time for me because I had to make a decision before I decided to move out to the suburbs. So I got engaged, and my partner was like, James, you're not bringing this furniture to my house. So I had to make a decision. I could either put my furniture in storage or I could merely get an office. And so I decided to get an office. And once I got the office, then my private practice started to pick up. So that was 10 years ago. So nevertheless, I got back in 2010. I also during that time, I got a job at Lincoln University, and I am the director or chair of counseling and human services. And so over the years, I have done sexuality research as it relates to sexual decision making. I've looked at how masculinity is constructed among Black men. I've looked at the roles that non-custodial parents play in their kids' lives. And so it's evolved. My career has evolved into now serving as editor-in-chief of the Journal. So again, with the Journal is significant at this period of time given the evolution of the social justice movement. And so if you can recall, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that's when Trayvon Martin was killed down in Florida. And that's when our country started to really turn its wheels and get some legs under supporting and trying to wrestle with how some Black men and how some people of color are treated in our society. And so with the journal coming out, several years ago, I always wanted to have access to a journal that was devoted towards the sexual expression of persons of African descent. And while I was in college or while I was in graduate school, there were no articles. I mean, there were articles, but the articles were scattered in this journal or that journal, but there wasn't one universal spot that folks could go to learn more about the continuum of sexual expression. So nevertheless, here we are 6 years later, and it's been awesome. It's been awesome in that the editor's note that I do for most of the issues, not all the issues, but for most of the issues, it gives me a platform to address some of the more sensitive issues in our society as it relates to people of color and people of African descent. In particular, I had a chance to talk about, issues around, say, Bill Cosby or R. Kelly or sex trafficking or sexual decision making or HIV/AIDS prevention. And it's been great because the editor's note as well as the actual journal, again, serves as a platform for people to come and share their work. I should also add that because of the journal, my colleagues and I were able to start an organization called the Association of Black Sexologists and Clinicians. And with that organization, we've been able to invite scholars and clinicians and educators to come and share their work in one setting. So the first conference we had was about 5 years ago, and it was in Philadelphia, and we had about 150 people there, and it took on a life of its own. And because it took on a life of its own, we were able to, shortly thereafter, 6 months later, we were able to host our first spring roundtable series in the U.S. Virgin Islands or St. Thomas. And while it's kind of follows the same format, the event that we do in St. Thomas has become more of like a think tank where people will come in and share their work, and they'll, talk for about 15, 20 minutes. And then the rest of us chime in to talk about the implications of the work that they have been doing and will continue to do. So we've had conferences, and again, we started off in Philadelphia, and then we went to Fort Lauderdale, and then we went to Chicago. We've hosted 4 conferences in St. Thomas during the last week in April, and the reason why we do it in the last week of April is that it's Carnival Week. So who doesn't want to go to St. Thomas to share their work and enjoy the festivities of Carnival each year? But also we've kind of shifted our focus from hosting events domestically to now focusing events internationally. So our first international lecture series was down in Cape Town, South Africa, about 3 years ago. And then last year, we were in Prague, Czech Republic. And actually, I just got back from Havana, Cuba last week as we hosted our third international lecture series. And next year, we'll be in Santa Marta, Colombia. And obviously, we'll be back in St. Thomas. And so between the journal and the organization and the professionals and the fellowship, really, that happens, this has been an extraordinary ride. So hosting a podcast at this point is another iteration of us sharing the work that we do. And, I'm really hoping that this will invite in yet another segment of our community to come in to share the work that they're doing.